Thank you. That might officially be my favorite introduction of all time. What a joy to be back with you, and I hope you'll be able to join us tonight as well. Something unexpected is happening. In 2025, belief in God and interest in the supernatural appear to be making a comeback. Now, if this is true, why would this be such a surprise? Let me take you back to the middle of the 20th century. So coming out of World War II, and given where science was understood to be at the time, there was a prominent movement called the Death of God movement. Time magazine, in an iconic cover, said in 1966, asked the question, is God dead? Fast forward to the early part of the 21st century, the God conversation was dominated by this movement called the New Atheists, largely coming out of 9/11, and like earlier atheists, proclaiming that God was dead, but also saying, and the world is far better off because of it. Figures like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. British journalist Christopher Hitchens wrote in his book, God is Not Great, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Now, over the past decade or two, you've also probably heard of this movement of nones, N-O-N-E-S, where less and less Americans are primarily identifying through their faith and through their religion. Given some of these factors, somebody could seemingly be justified in concluding that God is dead. But I think these conclusions are premature. First off, I think the God conversation is shifting in our culture. Many of you will recognize the name Jordan Peterson, probably one of the most influential academics and thinkers today through his podcast, he fills up entire stadiums talking about his book, We Who Wrestle with God, a Canadian psychologist. It seems this week, if I understood him correctly, that he believes Jesus is God and embraces the Christian narrative. We will see how this plays out. But what's interesting is in his book, We Who Wrestle with God, he argues, rather than saying like attacking the Bible like many critics did in the past, he actually says the Bible is necessary for the impetus of science. And he says, quote, it is the story on which Western civilization is predicated. You could think of other thinkers, not Christians, like Barry Weiss, Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man actor. And this week, interestingly enough, maybe 2 weeks ago, a gay atheist by the name of Jonathan Rauch was interviewed for the New York Times. And he said quite literally, America needs Jesus to survive. He said Christians were kind of onto something with their talk about family values. In fact, Joe Rogan a few weeks ago had a Canadian apologist on, Wes Huff. And if you haven't seen it, has created a worldwide conversation about the reliability of the Bible. Second, we've seen some high-profile conversions. Just one example would be Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, if you recognize her name, she grew up in a very fundamentalist, radical Muslim background. Abandoned her faith understandably and became an atheist. In fact, was friends with the New Atheist and argued against God for years. Well, in November 2023, she wrote an article called Why I Am Now a Christian. And she made the case, she said, there's a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. Became a Christian personally, and also said Christianity is necessary for the survival of civilization. Third, there's a growing awareness of the failure of secularism, culturally, scientifically, existentially. So just two quick examples of some books. One that came out at the end of 2024. One actually comes out next month by a New York Times columnist. He's Catholic, by the name of Ross Douthat. Now, Douthat began writing as a columnist for the New York Times during the heyday of the New Atheists. And he writes in this book, and when I had a chance to interview him, he says the conversation has been shifting about God. There's an openness to his audience, and he describes the New York Times audience as many of them, if not most of them, being unfamiliar with the tenets of Christianity. There's more of an openness and an interest in spiritual things than there was a few years ago. And he says in his book, he says, mystery and magic and enchantment seem to be rushing back into the world. Another example, this is a New York Times best-selling author. He's Orthodox by the name of Rod Dreher. He wrote a book called Living in Wonder, and he starts his book with a story about somebody who believes they encountered UFOs. And I'm reading this thinking, guy, why is he starting with this story? And he said, quite surprisingly, a lot of real thinkers today take UFO encounters more seriously than you might think. But his point was that actually this fascination in UFO encounters and things like psychedelics signals a deeper spiritual yearning that people are searching for that secularism cannot fulfill. And I think he's right. Fourth, Bible sales were up 22% in 2024. Now, that last one is somewhat tongue-in-cheek because these things can spike and go down. I understand that. But maybe, just maybe, there's an awareness that God's not dead. And there's a renewed spiritual interest. Now, I'm not saying that there's some great revival that's taking place. But I do think the proclamations that God is dead and that people would be enlightened and move on and be better off without God, those proclamations are false. And there just might be some evidence, so to speak, that Aslan is on the move. Now, in some ways, this shouldn't surprise us. One of the world's leading philosophers, probably the greatest living apologist today, you might recognize the name William Lane Craig. He's been a colleague of mine at Biola and Talbot for years. William Lane Craig, in 2008, wrote the cover story for a Christianity Today article. And the cover of it was exactly mirroring the Time cover from 1966. But instead of saying, is God dead? The title is, God is not dead yet. And he said, quote, the news of God's demise was premature. For at the same time theologians were writing God's obituary, a new generation of young philosophers was rediscovering his vitality. And he starts walking through in that article what we're going to talk about today, how while people were saying God is dead, the scientific and philosophical and even historical evidence was emerging to tell a very different story. Now, none of this should surprise you and me because 3,000 years ago, David wrote this in Psalm 19, 1 and 2. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. We're going to look at briefly 7 evidences that God is back in 2025. Number 1, the discovery of the beginning of the universe. Now, there's an old joke of some scientists who come to God and say, God, we can do everything you can do. God says, really, like what? They said, we can make human beings. God says, okay, show me. So they reach down to pick up some dust, and God says, wait a minute, get your own dust. Where did the dust come from? Stars? Where did the stars come from? Quantum fluctuations? Where did the quantum fluctuations come from? Any adequate worldview has to explain why there is something rather than nothing. And the beginning of the universe, the discovery of that in the 20th century, suggested that there might be a cause outside of the universe that brought it into existence. You might recognize the name Antony Flew because Antony Flew, for the last probably half part of the 20th century, quite literally helped set the agenda for atheism. He wrote a piece called Theology and Falsification that was the most widely reprinted philosophical treatise of the 20th century. He presented it at the Socratic Club at the University of Oxford that was actually chaired by C.S. Lewis, interestingly enough. Well, he died in 2010. In 2007, he released a book, and the title was There Is a God: How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now, I'm going to read you a quote from this that unpacks it. It's a little longer than I typically would, but bear with me because what he says is fascinating. He says, when I first met the Big Bang Theory as an atheist, it seemed to me that the theory made a big difference because it suggested that the universe had a beginning, and that the first sentence in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, was related to an event in the universe. As long as the universe could be comfortably thought to be not only without end, but also without beginning, it would remain easy to see its existence as a brute fact. And if there had been no reason to think the universe had a beginning, there would be no reason to postulate something else that produced the whole thing. But the Big Bang Theory changed all of that. If the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning. You see, Flew said, when he started, the science was pointing against God, but throughout his career, it started to suggest that God was real, and the beginning of the universe was one of those indicators. Now, philosophers will lay this out in a very simple argument. In fact, I was sitting next to a student from Chapman University a few years ago. She goes, well, why do you believe God exists? Pulled out a napkin, and I actually laid out this argument. It's really simple. It's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And premise number one is whatever begins to exist has a cause. If something begins to exist, there must be a sufficient reason why it began. You can't get something from nothing. Empirically, whenever something begins, we recognize there's a cause, and we never see something beginning without a cause. It's common sense that whatever begins to exist has a cause, but with the discovery of Big Bang, we begin to realize, premise number two, that the universe began to exist. The evidence seems to pretty strongly point towards the universe not being eternal. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then what's our conclusion? This is the participatory part of the program. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, what kind of cause must that be? It must be timeless, since time started at the Big Bang. Must be changeless, because you can't have change without time. Must be minimally really smart, minimally really powerful, and a personal agent to cause such change. That sounds a lot like God. You see, the beginning of the universe points to a beginner. Second evidence that God is back in 2025, the fine-tuning of the universe, the discovery that the universe and the laws of physics and cosmology that make life possible exist within a very small range. What do I mean by this? I want to imagine you come visit me. I live in Southern California in a town called San Juan Capistrano. Have you been there? It's beautiful. My wife and I love it. We've lived there for 2 decades. Southern Orange County, not too far from like Capo Beach, San Clemente. There's some undeveloped land out behind, kind of to the east. Imagine that you come down to visit me. We just decide to go exploring up through these hills, and we come across an abandoned cabin that looks like this. And you think, you know what? That's interesting. Let's explore it. So you go walking up, but you notice something strange. You hear your favorite song in the background, Beat It by Michael Jackson. You ignore the obvious hint and decide, you know what, let's go inside. But as you approach, you notice something also strange. You smell the scent of your most beloved meal. You go, huh. You open up the door, you see shoes that fit you perfectly, a jacket that's exactly your size, the specific magazines you like to read. You open up, there's a small refrigerator in the corner, and it's all the snacks that you use. There's a tiny bathroom, and it's the exact toiletries that you use. Now, what would you suspect? Besides thinking you were in a horror movie, none of you go, oh, what a coincidence, this is crazy. Thing after thing after thing aligned precisely for me. Maybe one or two, but at some point you go, this smells like a put-up job. There are too many things lined up for me. Someone was expecting my arrival. A physicist by the name of Freeman Dyson said, as we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. So there's certain laws, you might say, that govern the universe in physics and cosmology, and they exist on a razor's edge within a very narrow range, and the slightest change to the left or the right, and the universe becomes inhospitable to life. Now, there are dozens of these kinds of parameters that are each set, like the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, etc. But you can start to put these together mathematically and ask, what are the odds that the universe would be set the way that it is, so to speak? Well, what if we just take two of these? Gravity must be fine-tuned 1 times 10 with 40 zeros after it. What's called the cosmological constant, 1 times 10 with 53 zeros after it. So what if we take two of these dozens of parameters that must each be carefully fine-tuned? What are the odds that we would get those two right to have a universe capable of supporting life? Well, those two alone become 1 part in 100 million, trillion, 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 trillion. Now that's a big number. If you can't grasp that, just think of our new national debt. That number is actually roughly equivalent to 1 atom out of the entire known universe. So what are the odds that you take a spaceship around the universe with really small tweezers and find 1 atom out of the universe? It's impossible you do that out of my shoes, let alone the entire universe. Just as the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner, the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a cosmic fine-tuner. Third evidence God is back is the origin of life. What we've learned about the origin of life. So Antony Flew asked this question. He said, how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? In other words, how do we get life from non-life? How do we get organic matter from inorganic matter? Now, for centuries, all scientists, regardless of worldview, basically believe that there must be some simple explanation. If you have the right chemicals and the right circumstance, life just pops into existence. Well, that began to change with the discovery in certain technology, things like the electron microscope, where we could peer into the depths of the cell, and the discovery of things like DNA. Now, let me spell this out for us. If you take the average adult human body, and to be honest with you, you're pretty much looking at it. I'm 5'9", 150, so I think I'm about as average you can get, at least for a male. So in my body on average, there'd be about 30 trillion cells. If you take the DNA out of one cell, and DNA, as you can see, it's like a ladder that's twisted, and it contains information on it. If you, don't pull that slide back. If you take the DNA and you uncoil it in one cell, it would be 6 feet in length, one cell. So if I took the 30 trillion cells in my body and strung them together, it would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. Wow is exactly the right response to let that sink in. What does DNA do? It stores information. So one estimate is that a single cell in your body has the equivalent of 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. This is in part why Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Do you see the challenge to naturalism? How do you get this complexity and sophistication and information in a mindless, blind, physical system and universe? Stephen Meyer, a Christian apologist, a philosopher of science trained at Cambridge, he said this. He said, whenever we find specified information and we know the causal story of how that information arose, we always find that it arose from an intelligent source. So if you get a text and it's legible, you trace it back to a texture. If you read a blog, you trace it back to a blogger. If you read a book, you trace it back to an author. If we go walking outside and in the clouds it says drink Coke, none of you would say, yep, Sean, that's what happens up here in Northern California when a storm is coming down from Oregon. We would know if it said drink Coke, we trace it back to a mind and an intelligence. When the cell is far more sophistication, far more information than humans are close to creating today, I think the best explanation is there's a mind behind it. You might say the information in the cell points to an author of life. Fourth reason God is back in 2025 is our understanding of the origin of consciousness. Now, what do I mean by this? I invited on a young libertarian, African-American, atheist thinker by the name of Coleman Hughes. He had a podcast I listened to for years, really enjoyed it. Reached out to him. I saw him recently doing some commentary on CNN. I just had my team reach out. I said, hey, I'm a Christian apologist. Would you be willing to talk about your beliefs, your worldview? He's written a book on race and talk about God. He goes, sure. At the end, I asked him a question that I want you to remember and use in your own conversations. I love to ask people this question. It's simply, you're an atheist, you don't believe in God. But is there anything about the world that suggests you might be wrong and that there might be a God? Is there anything about the world that gives you pause to think God might exist? He said two things, but one of them was consciousness. He said, in a materialistic world where there's laws of nature and there's chemicals in motion, how does consciousness, let alone self-consciousness, appear? He said, that gives me pause. And I think he's exactly right. Now, if you go back to the last century, the first part of the 20th century, the idea that humans had a soul was not only considered false, it was ridiculed. But a professor at Biola University, he's spoken here. You might recognize the name J.P. Moreland, arguably one of the leading philosophers today. Co-wrote a book this past year called The Substance of Consciousness, making a case for what's called substance dualism. Namely that humans are not just body, we're not just soul, we are body and soul. And he writes this. He said, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Things are changing. We are witnessing a resurgence of substance dualism, which he says is undergoing an unforeseen revival. Do you understand the weight of this question? How do you get things like free will and consciousness from matter? How does it happen? By the way, here's your homework. Go home and try to explain pain in purely physical terms. If you can do it, I will give you a scholarship to Biola. You can't. It occurs through your body, but pain cannot be reduced to size and color and physical characteristics. It's a sense of hurtfulness, but that's not solely physical. So I invited a well-known skeptic onto my YouTube channel, Michael Shermer. He's a professor at Chapman. He's written a number of best-selling books, friends with a lot of the new atheists. I said, hey, would you debate God and morality with me for an hour? We ended up debating for 2 hours. And he believes there's objective morality and that consciousness is real. And I said, well, how do you explain this? And he said, at a certain level of complexity of matter, consciousness emerges. And I said, that strikes me as the ultimate non-explanation. Yes. It's kind of like magic. And his answer was, he said, well, in certain economic systems, inflation just emerges. And my response in part was, inflation is very different than consciousness. Inflation is an effect. Consciousness is a cause. Friends, just like there's no naturalistic explanation for the origin of life, there is no naturalistic explanation for the origin of consciousness. But on the other hand, human consciousness points towards a cosmic consciousness. If God is a conscious mind, we should not be surprised that we are conscious beings who reflect this God. Fifth reason God is back is the moral law. 15 years ago in 2010, I had a debate with a high school professor in my town who's a PhD. And we were invited to debate what best explains morality, basically God or science and evolution. 2 weeks before the debate, I heard him on a podcast. He said, I'm debating this guy, Sean McDonald. And I thought, he can't even get my name right. On whether you have to believe in God to be moral. And I heard that, I thought, he doesn't even understand what we're debating. The question is not you have to believe in God to be moral. Of course, someone who doesn't believe in God can be moral. Why? Because Romans 2 tells us, even people without the law know the law because it's written where? On their hearts. Even people who don't believe in God still live in God's world and are made in God's image. And part of being made in God's image is knowing right and wrong. The question is not, do we have to believe in God to know right and wrong? And the question is, can you have objective right and wrong in the absence of God? Can an atheist or naturalist worldview adequately ground objective moral values and duties? Here's the simple argument. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Fyodor Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, all is permissible. And I think he's right. We don't have objective human value, and you don't have objective duties to one another if there's not a moral lawgiver. We might feel that we do, but those feelings are tricks of evolution to get us to just behave. But second, objective moral values and duties do exist. You say, how do you know this? It's obvious. It's obvious. Everybody lives and acts as if you should keep promises and you should tell the truth. In fact, just look at how people right now speak about justice. Today, I hope you're praying with me that we actually see peace happen in the Middle East between Hamas and between Israel. I'm not making a political statement here. Please hear me, although I have opinions about this. What's interesting is both sides accuse the other side of genocide. But nobody, as far as I'm aware of, says, you know what, genocide is fine. It's no different than picking an ice cream flavor. Maybe somebody used to say that on TikTok, not anymore. We might differ over what is just or what is genocide, but humans understand intrinsically that we have a right to life. So if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, but objective moral values and duties do exist, what follows? Therefore, God exists. The moral law points towards a moral law giver. Sixth evidence God is back, modern day miracles. One of the leading New Testament scholars in the world is a brilliant, just humble man, a friend of us at Biola by the name of Craig Keener. He has written multiple, multi-volume commentaries. I literally don't know how he does it. And he was working on a multi-volume commentary on the book of Acts years ago. And as he started to write it, he's like, you know what? There's a lot of miracle claims here in the book of Acts. Has anyone done a careful, documented academic study of miracle claims? And he discovered nobody had. So he paused his study on Acts and started studying cases of modern day miracles to see if Hume was right centuries ago that these are exceptions and not the norm. Well, fascinatingly, in 2010, he published over 1,000 pages, I don't know the count, 2-volume academic book called Miracles. And here's his thesis. The kind of miracle claims frequently attested in the Gospels and Acts are also attested by many eyewitnesses today. Now, what's interesting about this, he says we're talking about different countries. So he looks at the Middle East, looks at Latin America, he looks at Asia, he looks at Europe, around different countries, different denominations, charismatic, non-charismatic, Pentecostal, non-Pentecostal, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Baptists, you name it, all over the place. And he says, bottom line, that there are many people reporting the kinds of things we see in the Bible. You say, what kinds of things? The blind receiving sight, the deaf hearing, people healed from sicknesses, including things like HIV, encounters with the demonic, and even examples of raisings from the dead. Now, by the way, he does say miracles are the exception. They're not the norm. And many times God does not answer prayers. In his own life, he and his wife were not able to have kids, and he had multiple miscarriages. He says sometimes God doesn't answer prayers. I don't know why, and it's painful. But because he doesn't answer prayers some, if not many times, doesn't mean God is not answering prayers today in the way we would want him to. So in his study, he concludes that hundreds of millions, let that sink in, hundreds of millions of people alive today believe they have personally experienced or witnessed a miracle. He says, okay, you might say I'm exaggerating, then we'll just settle with tens of millions of people alive today who believe they witnessed or seen a miracle. Now, he published that 2-volume set in 2010. In 2021, he followed up with a more popular book to answer objections against it and to list and name even more cases of miracles. So he wrote in his book, Miracles Today, which I would encourage you, if you're fascinated by this topic, look into that and study it. Now, what he writes is there's even cases of healings captured on video. Now, don't go home and Google healings captured on video. Chances are you will not be able to trust it. It might even be generated by AI. But get a copy of his book. Follow the footnotes. Here's a careful academic documenting his sources, talking to witnesses, and even argues that in some countries like China, a significant portion of people coming to Christ cite miracles they saw as the reason why. Now, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if this applies to you. Not yet. But here's the question. If you think you have witnessed or experienced a miracle, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Now, you might be thinking, what do you mean by a miracle? I mean, sometimes somebody dives and saves something volleyball, and people in volleyball, they'll say, that's a miracle. Not what I mean, as awesome as that is. What I don't mean is if during like the Christmas holiday season, you're like, oh, I forgot a gift for my mother-in-law. God, I need you to guide me to the perfect parking spot and the perfect gift. And you find it, you're like, miracle. Now, I think God does care about the small things and can do that. But can you at least understand why some skeptic would be like, I'm not convinced that happens to me sometimes too, minus the prayer. I mean something you've seen or experienced that can't be explained naturally and points towards divine intervention, a supernatural act of God. If that describes you, you think you have seen or experienced a miracle, let me see your hands. Put it up high. Put it up high and hold that up. I want you to look around. This is the same response I get every time I ask this question. You can put them down in audiences around the world. And I would guess maybe half of the hands went up. And the low end, a third, sometimes 2/3. Now, if we had time, I would love to go around with a microphone and hear some of your stories. But if we did that, there would always be that one guy. And by the way, if you're that one guy, you actually don't know that you're that guy. That's what makes it tricky. Honestly, if we went and heard the stories, I have a feeling we would hear some just tear-jerking stories of supernatural things that God has done. Miracles today point to a supreme miracle worker. We've looked at philosophical evidence, we've looked at scientific evidence. This last one is historical. The historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Perhaps the leading scholar on the resurrection today is named Gary Habermas. He grew up in a Christian home, experienced doubt, so as a high school student, He started using those old note cards, writing down evidences for the resurrection and then responses to them, and he filed them away in boxes. He was consumed with figuring out if we can know historically if Jesus rose from the grave. Did his senior high school paper and project on this. Then went through a season of doubt. 1976, went to Michigan State University and actually defended his PhD thesis under the title, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Rational Inquiry. Now, in case you missed it, Michigan State University is not a Christian school. Now, some of you at Ohio State are like, that's right, that was not my point. Neither is Ohio State. My point is, if you're gonna defend the resurrection with a committee that's not Christian, and they have to put their name on it, you've gotta make a pretty convincing scholarly case. Well, he went after that through a 10-year period of doubt, considered becoming a Buddhist. And it kept motivating him to study the resurrection. If you'll show the slide before, he is in the process of publishing a 4-volume defense of the resurrection. That is volume 1 that came out last year. It's actually over 1,000 pages long and weighs more than 5 pounds. I bought it just to exercise with it. Now that first volume is what he considers the evidence for the resurrection. Volume 2 is a response to all the objections. Volume 3 is kind of the data on his research, and volume 4 is what the resurrection means. And this is personal to him because his first wife died in their 40s about 3 decades ago. And he said it was belief in the resurrection that helped him navigate and grieve with hope through that tragedy. But what Gary chronicles is that over the past century and a half, the conversation has shifted. Is that the vast majority of scholars, who by the way are not conservative, agree with certain historical facts, such as the crucifixion of Jesus. That the disciples report experiences with Jesus they believed were real appearances of the risen Jesus. That Saul became a follower of Jesus after an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. And the tomb of Jesus was found empty shortly after his death. He said the majority of scholars agree with those, and the evidence is compelling. But here's his conclusion. There's only one explanation that can account for all the facts. Namely, that Jesus lived, died, was buried, the tomb was empty, and he has risen on the 3rd day. I would argue the resurrection confirms Jesus as God's unique revelation in history. I had a chance to interview Gary about this. I said, Gary, you went through 2 seasons of doubt, although he said he hadn't doubted for like 20 years. I said, would you have been so motivated to research this, like 60, 70 hours a week for decades, if you had not gone through doubt? He kind of leaned back and paused and said, no, I don't think I would have. God can use our doubts and our brokenness for good if we'll allow him. Now, some of you are saying, Sean, there's objections to this. And you're right, there are objections to this online and in academics. I just laid out the beginning of it. But there's also objections we have to answer. Why does God allow evil is perhaps the biggest one, which is personal for us down south with the fires. Why doesn't God stop this? Now, I think there's answers for this. I teach an entire class on this, on why God allows evil. But that's something we have to take seriously. But I think what we've looked at this morning is sufficient to show that the claim that God is dead is overstated. From the beginning of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe, to the origin of life and consciousness, to the existence of the moral law, from modern day miracles to the historical evidence Jesus has risen, I think one thing is clear. God is not dead. He is back and alive and moving in 2025. Amen. Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks so much for watching our Bayside online service. We're so glad that you're actually part of our church, which you are, even though you're watching from all over the world, and we have people literally watching from all over the world. You are part of our family, and we want to get to know you. So please make sure you get in touch with us. Let us know your story. We'd love to hear you and serve you in any way we can. Also, part of what drives the way we connect as a church globally is giving. And so if you're part of our family, we would love you to start giving to our church. Those resources, we steward them to reach people all over the world. And we hear amazing stories about what Jesus is doing with your resources. So if you already give, thank you. If not, you can start giving. We would love that. And then finally, we have all kinds of stuff we do. We have a podcast network. We have like 10 podcasts that address a whole bunch of different things in your life. So if you're a podcaster, join us in the Thrive Podcast Network. We'd love to serve you. We've got a ton of stuff there. We just want to make sure that you feel part of our family. So we love you. Thank you so much for being part of this family, and we will see you next week.